Good morning, fellow ruminators. Welcome back to another session, Rumination with Andrew. It is my distinct pleasure to be with you one more time to discuss a very important topical matter. Now, as we've stated yesterday, this month is Black History Month. So many people around the world, particularly in the United States, will be looking at the impact of people of African descent on the history and on current events, right? On things happening around the world. Now, I have said on many occasions, and I categorically say it again, that there are no races, right? We have one human family, one human race, right? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And we know that he created man on the sixth day, right? We are the crown act of his creation. Now, the fact of the matter, and we have mentioned this when I did the video on Are the Jews God's Chosen People? That was my first video on this channel in which I stated that God, absolutely, when he created man, he wanted us to be united, right? He did not create us to be at loggerheads and totally divisive as we are today. When sin entered the world, right, we became divisive and we became divided because sin is rebellion against God, right? We joined the devil, Lucifer, in his rebellion against the God of heaven. As a result of that, God had to separate the nations because after the flood, we talked about the flood also in Genesis 6, where, in which Noah, he preached for 120 years, right? Can you imagine living for so long? These people lived until 900 and odd years, right? They lived a long time on the face of the earth. So now preaching for 120 years was not something that was unusual in the time of the antediluvians. We call that era the antediluvians, before the flood, right? Before the flood, for example, Adam lived until 930 years. We have the longest man to have ever lived and died was Methuselah, who lived 969 years. We have corrected that on some occasions where we say that he's not the longest man to have ever lived. We know that Enoch is the longest man to have ever lived because he did not die, right? He was transported, as the Bible tells us, to heaven where he resides, right? So he has never died. That means that he is the longest man to have ever lived, all right? But the longest man to have ever lived and died is Methuselah, who died when he was 969 years old. Fascinating. Now, we did mention also that the Bible did tell Adam that if he and his wife, of course, Eve, if they had eaten of a particular fruit, right, a forbidden fruit that was placed in the midst of the Garden of Eden, in which God placed them, right, that their eyes would have been opened and they would know good and evil, right? Now, by that time, they only knew good and they were happy, they were contented, they were living harmoniously, right? When they just knew good. The fact of the matter is that human beings, and I think beings in general, tend to be curious. I think that's one of the reasons why the devil, this is now my assertion, the Bible didn't say so, but this is my assertion that the devil himself was curious, Lucifer, because he wasn't made the devil, he was made Lucifer, right? And he must have been curious about where did God come from and the power that he has amassed. But he himself, Lucifer, was created with enormous amount of power, right? And he was wondering, perhaps I can be as powerful as God, right? Because he was in fact powerful, but not all powerful. God made Lucifer extremely powerful, a powerful angel, more powerful than any other being in the face of the universe. And it will be very foolhardy for us to think that we are the only ones in this massive universe that God has made, right? Now, we are the only ones who have sinned, and for that reason, we are alienated from the beings that are righteous, right? Not that, angels, God tells us, visit us because they are here to help in the salvation of human beings, right? But they are not partakers of our nature, right? Our sinful nature that is, right? So before sin entered the world, God communicated with man, right? And his wife, which was Eve, frequently. God would walk in the garden, right? And that is why when they sinned, God came. But they ran this time. They ran away from God because they knew that they had done something of which he had instructed them not to do. Now, one of the things is that sin and God cannot coexist, right? And that's what we have to understand. It is not that God is a person who wants to burn us, right, in hell, as many people think, right? This judgment God who is very strict, right? And he just wants to burn us in hell. It's that sin and God cannot coexist. We are going to be destroyed immediately if we find ourselves in the presence of God, because God is a consuming fire, and it's not the fire that we think we know. And the fire that we make is hot. Can you imagine the fire, right? That is God. It has to be a million times or a trillion times hotter than we can ever imagine, right? Even in heaven, as we said, that Lucifer, if you read Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28, you will see that, Lucifer, before he sinned, before he rebelled against God, that he was the only one, according to what the Bible tells us, that was able to walk up and down in the coals of fire. And what that suggests is that God's presence is fire. He's a being, but the fact of the matter, he's so powerful, right, that it is not any being, even the righteous angels in heaven, who can really, what should I say now, stand in the immediate presence of God because of his glory, because of his being an all-powerful being, right? And that is what we need to understand. So Lucifer, having that great and exalted privilege, thought himself to be someone more special, which he was to an extent, but not that he was on the level of God, that he should be God himself. And that is why he sought worship, and he wanted to reform, as he suggested, the government of God, right? Now, that cannot happen because, as some people would say, two bulls cannot rule in the same pen. So the fact of the matter is that God had to evict him from heaven, which he did, right? And we know that Lucifer brought his rebellion. Now, the rebellion started in heaven, and that's what we need to understand. So we can't say that God is discriminatory because he sent Lucifer to, or the devil, when he decided now, because the devil or Satan mean that he is a person who is in rebellion, someone who is fighting against God, the great deceiver, right? Now, the rebellion started in heaven, and some of the angels decided that they would join in a third, the Bible tells us, in the rebellion against the God of heaven. Now he was cast to the earth, the Bible tells us. But it's not that God wanted to just cast the devil to the earth. The devil came here, or God placed him here to test our loyalty to him. Because remember now that the enemy, that's the devil, the angels, he started with them first because he wanted them to convince them. He wanted to convince them that his government would have been a better government than God's government. And if you look at our rebellion here on earth too, we tend to think the same way. We tend to think that science, we exalt science and other things and say that our ideas are better than God's ideas, right? That God's exalted word, the Bible, and the principles outlined and declared in the Bible are not as exalted as men's understanding of what knowledge, particularly science, is all about. And we've got to be careful about that, right? Because that's exactly what the enemy told the angels, and 1/3 were deceived and cast out of the high estate. They were living in heaven and they occupied exalted positions. And as a result of the rebellion, they were, they were demoted from these exalted positions. And it's very, very important that we understand that. Now, I say this to say, yesterday somebody sent me a video of someone, just ranting about the fact that Black people are the original people, right? And that we are the Shemites, right? That we are the sons and daughters of Shem. Now, remember now that after Noah died, and it's important that we understand that because our school system has taught us that there is no God for the most part, right? That what we have is science. And so they've taught us the theory of evolution. And the theory of evolution cannot cohere with the Bible. Some people, including the Catholic faith, have hybridized that philosophy, right, and have merged it with aspects of the Bible. But the Bible and the theory of evolution cannot coexist, right? God is the creator of heaven and earth, and he created out of nothing, right? So all this Big Bang theory, yeah, it is not what the Bible teaches, right? And it's either you're going to go by what the Bible teaches, or you're going to go by what men through science teach. You've got to make that decision, right? You cannot accept both, right? And this is what you need to understand, because either God is God and he can create something out of nothing, or there has to be some kind of explosion and then he begins his creative process, right? And his creative genius, and the two are not going to be coexisting, cohabiting, right, in the same space. I hope you understand that, because some of us think that we can merge these two philosophies together, the biblical philosophy of creation and what the scientific understanding is, through the whole understanding of the theory of evolution. Now, let me just categorically say here that not all scientists believe in the theory of evolution. There are lots of scientists who believe in the biblical story, the biblical narrative of creation. But let's go back to the flood. So we understand that there was a worldwide flood, and the majority, if not all people, but was 8 people, right, were saved in the ark, right? In the ark. Not that God wanted them to be destroyed, but Noah preached for 120 years and they laughed at Noah. Now, one of the things you must understand is that before the flood, it had never rained on the earth. Go and read the biblical account in Genesis 6, and I think right up to 8, 9 thereabout. You can go and read the history of the flood in the Bible. You will see that it had never rained, right? So the fact of the matter is that when Noah said that there was going to be a flood, people were laughing. They said, "What are you talking about? It had never even rained. We have never even seen rain, sprinkling. You're talking about a flood?" We would have understood now in today's world, because we have seen floods, right? We have seen lots of rains, and when we have heavy torrential rains, right, showers, we know that this can create a flood. But think about those people that they had never in their lives, right, in their long-lived lives, and some of them, as we said, lived over 900, 800 years. And so they had not seen this thing, and they were wondering, what strange thing is this man talking about? And then he's building this big ship, or ark, if you will, on the earth, and saying that it's going to rain. That was a revolutionary idea in that time, and people laughed at him, right? They mocked him. So generations came and generations went. And the sad thing about it is that some of the people who laughed at him, they helped him to build the ark. Some of them helped him, but they said, he's foolish. This guy is going nuts. But I'm sure Noah was a great guy. He was kind, generous, right? And they probably thought that they should help him because he, really was, I'm sure that they saw that he meant no ill intent. Now, there are times that we have revolutionary messages and people think that we are nuts. They don't think that because the message doesn't align with the majority or what the intellectuals say, then we begin to think that we question that sort of message. And this person must be an unbalanced person to be talking about a flood, right? And that's how many of them thought. The floods did come as God had said, because when God speaks, we've got to listen, right? And I told you, and I've said it many times, that if God says it's going to rain at 2 p.m., and even at 1:58 p.m., it has not started to rain. No matter what the meteorologists say to you, that it might not rain. If God says it's going to rain, it's going to rain. And at 1:59 and seconds into 1:59, yeah, but I can tell you at 2 p.m., it is going to rain. And that is what happened during Noah's time. It rained and it flooded the earth, and the majority of the earth's population was destroyed, right? God had to destroy them because they were destroying themselves, right? We learned in Genesis 6 that there was nothing in their imagination that they had not experimented with. Every sin that you can imagine, they experimented with that. And they were destroying the earth, and violence, as the Bible says, was a part of that era. Think about the scientific development in that time. Men lived, as we said, for over 800 years, some of them 900 years, right? And they were far healthier than we are today because their constitution, their physical constitution, that is, was not very far away from Adam, right? And we didn't learn that Adam had any illness, right? He just lived for 930 years and he died, right? As men started to exploit, right, and to abuse their bodies by eating and by disobeying the laws of health, we saw where men's, mortality rate, okay, began to be, we saw that they lived shorter lives, right? And that's what we have to understand. Now, God created man, right? He did not say he created Black people or white people. Let me begin by looking at this article. Or maybe I should begin with the video that this guy sent me yesterday, one of my friends sent me yesterday. Let me begin with that video to let you see what this guy was saying, because we need to be very careful with how we express ourselves. Are you hearing? Yeah, it seems like you're not going to be able to hear what he is saying. So let me just, summarize briefly what the video was about. The video really talked about the fact that Black people are the descendants of Shem, which the Bible does not teach, right? We know that Black people, as we know it, right, are Hamitic people. I'm sorry about that, right? So Black people are Hamitic people, means that we are the children or the descendants of Ham. Now, after the flood, we know that, only Noah and his immediate family and their wives, right, were saved. right? Because the people decided that they would rebel against God and that they would not have gotten into the ark. And God closed the ark, that Noah could not even open it because God closed it. And what God closes, no man can open. And what he opens, no man can shut, right? Because he is all powerful and he runs the show in the universe, right? He, because of sin, he allows us sometimes to do what we want. But then eventually, when his patience has run out, right, he is going to act. And that is why we think now, and all civilizations in all the empires of the world and all these monarchies, they thought they were running the show. And God allows them for a time, right? They have their time and they have their seasons. The United States is the empire of the world, and God is giving her her time. And she's bidding she thinks that she controls the world and that God is not in fact involved in the affairs of this world. But God is bidding her her time, right? And if in due season, right, when he is ready, right, he is going to dispense judgment on the sins that the United States is committing, right, as an empire, because we know that empires are not godly nations. And that's what you need to understand. So when you hear them talking about, oh, the Israelis and and the US is a Christian nation, no empire can be a Christian nation, right? Because if you're an empire, it means that you are the dictator of the world. And God is not interested in dictators. And that is why after the flood, he and men started to come together because they did not want a flood, because they were still rebelling against God, even though they had been saved. And you'd have thought that Noah and his children would have had children, and they would have instructed them, and I'm sure they did, about what happened, right? But again, God gives everybody freedom of choice, and Noah's children's children, right? His grandchildren and other children that generations went by, they decided that they would rebel. Some of them, not all of them, but some of them continued in their rebellion against God because they were wondering, how could God destroy an almost an entire population, right? Or the populations of the earth were destroyed. And God did not want to do it, right? It was not his intention to destroy the members of the world, but because they had been engaged in committing some atrocities. And we talked about violence and their rebellion, and what they were doing was sickening. It sickened God. In fact, God even, right, had to lament his creation of man. Right? Can you imagine God being sorry? Because God is all-knowing, right? But it's to show you how loving he is that he gave Noah, right? He dispensed his grace. And he allowed Noah 120 years to preach the gospel of salvation. That was the gospel, a massive gospel of salvation. And we learned that in the last days, there will also be another salvation gospel where God is going to call the world, right? That there is coming a fire, right? And that we need to get ready. And we need to, with his help, right, expunge sin from our lives and become righteous and pure, right, as he wants. Because we can't live with God if we don't have righteous hearts. We just cannot, because God's the righteous God and he is a consuming fire. So the fact that if we're not righteous, then we are not going to be happy with him, right? Because his exalted nature and the purity and holiness of his character, right, cannot accept and cannot cohabit, cannot coexist with sin, right? Now, so these people in the antediluvian world, they were destroyed, except Noah and his family, right? And then these people, Noah and his family had, they they procreated and had children on the earth, on the face of the earth. But these children also, some of them became rebellious, right? Now, remember now that Noah had three sons. He had Shem, Japheth, and Ham. Now, when these people became rebellious, they said, oh, let's go and make a Tower of Babel, right? So they went and they made a huge tower. They wanted the tower to reach heaven because their purpose was to study also, not only to reach where God was, as they thought they could, but also to study the atmospheric conditions. And we think we're so brilliant, but you have to understand that these men, as we say, are living, even after the flood, we're living to being 700, 800 years, right? So they had a lot of experience in terms of studying nature and stuff like that. We think we're the bright ones, but we need to rethink our positions, right? Because we're so much detached from that era that we don't understand the biblical account of what took place, right? So afterwards now, they decided that they were going to build this large, massive building going up to the sky. And then they would, if God decides that he's going to send another flood, then they could escape it, right? But this was, to them, going to be something that was more powerful than God himself, right? That God could not destroy whatever building they decided to build, right? Now, it was that time that as they continue to build, because God likes to watch us behave stupidly, right? And he sits there. I can imagine God sitting sometimes and watching us, talking our nonsense, right? Behaving foolishly, and he just watches. And when it's time for him, one of the things about him, or he tries to let us know that what we're doing is nonsense and it's foolishness, right? But a lot of times, because we're so arrogant and proud, right? And so caught up with ourselves, like Lucifer, we don't listen to him. And then he has to dispense judgment. And he had to come down and he destroyed the building and destroyed lots of them. But not only that, he confounded their languages, because before the flood, men only spoke one language, right? So after the people's language was confounded, then they had to separate because they could not understand each other, right? Like almost like the Spanish, and they're speaking English, and they're speaking, I'm not saying that they spoke those languages at the time, I'm just giving you an understanding of what it meant if everybody was speaking Spanish and Portuguese, and you didn't understand. Then you have to move with someone who spoke your language, right? Because that's the purpose of human interaction, that we have to communicate, right? And if we can't communicate, then we're going to find somebody with whom we can communicate, right? It's something natural. So men, as they were able to find their language community, they moved and they separated and they occupied all parts of the world. Now, they wanted to occupy one part of the world in their rebellion against God. And think about globalization. It's also a recreation of that mentality where men want to come together in rebellion against God. This humanism, behaving that we are in charge of our own affairs and we don't need God to help us in anything. And that is a Luciferian idea, because even Lucifer, being a very exalted angel and very powerful, cannot live without God, because our life depends on God, right? We don't have the breath. We are not the creators of the air and the oxygen that we breathe, right? Only God can do that, right? And let us say that we're able to clone individuals and do all that stuff. We can't inhale the breath of life in any soul, in any creature. And all these, artificial oxygen and stuff like that we do, which is good because it saves some people's life, but it's not like the natural oxygen that only God can make. And we need to understand that, right? We need to understand that. But given the fact that God separated the nations, right? And they spoke different languages and they went into different geographical regions. Now, before they only spoke one language and they belonged to one community of people. In fact, the three sons came from the same father, and Adam was our father, our first father, and Noah, and all of us, right, are descendants of Adam. So how can we think that we have different races, right, when we all came from the same man and woman? It is ridiculous. Yes, because God is God, right? After the flood, the earth was broken up, right? It was a different topography. The entire world was turned upside down because it was a massive flood. It was a worldwide flood, right? And the scientists have neglected that, but that is the biblical account. And we have seen archaeologists, for example, was it in Iran, who have found fragments of the ark, all right, of Noah's ark. And they were giving a description of just one plank of wood, right, that was used to make the ark. And that several men had to carry just a little plank of wood that made the ark. Because back then, men were mightier, stronger, had a stronger constitution than what we have today. They were giants, as the Bible says, in the land. Some people suggest, some archaeologists suggest that Noah, not Noah, Adam could have been 15, 16 feet tall, right? So you're talking about giants in the world. We talk about Goliath in the Bible, the war between David and Goliath. And, the Bible talks about his height, and he could have been round about 9, 10 feet tall, right? So these people were massive people, right? We like to think of ourselves as more intelligent, but they were not only physically stronger, but they were intellectually stronger. Think about also the names that, generations in Genesis, they were able to just tell the stories by heart and tell everything in detail what their parents told them, right? It was not somebody writing it down and preserving it because it was necessary, right? We're writing down things because we can't remember a lot of things. We'd like to think that writing is the highest form of civilization, but it is not by any sort of imagination. In fact, I think we have become duller because there are lots of things that are in writing and we fail to read them. And even if we read them, we can't remember them. And I'm guilty of that. Lots of things I've read and I can't remember what I read. I have to go back and consult the reading and stuff like that. Think about these people who never forgot what they read, or not what they read, but what they were told, and they would pass it down verbatim to successive generations. What intellectual depth that they had back then. But let's get back on track, right? So we have now that these people, these three familial groups, with the ones from Shem, Ham, and Japheth, right? And these are the major, what we call races that we find on the earth. So we have Japheth, right, is the father, is known as the father of the white race. And this guy, this black guy who was talking, that the video of which my friend sent me, is saying that, people are saying that the Shemites are white. The Shemites are not white. And nobody's saying that. No serious minded scholar has ever said that the Shemites or the descendants of Shem were white. We have always said that descendants of Shem are what we call the Semites, right? The ones who are Asians, right? That is the Shemites. So the Jews would be included in that, right? Abraham was a descendant of Shem, right? Now, Japheth, right, we have known, right, to be the father of what we call the European race, people who live in Europe, right? And we have Ham, right? And God talks about, Ham a lot, because we talked about even in the Psalms, when God was compiling the history of the Jews, he talked about when he sent them into the land of Ham. And the land of Ham was Egypt, right? We are black people, what we call black people, but they were Hamitic people. We are Hamitic people. We are descendants of Ham. Now, because they were all brothers and they came from the same father, and their father came from the same father, which is Adam. Well, Adam was not his direct father, but all of the people there, came from Adam. The antediluvian people came from Adam, just like we. So because these people are connected, we are all connected into one family. But because God is not a lover of rebellion, God is not a lover of rebellion, and he does not like to see his creatures rebelling against him in a united effort, right? What he did was send us across the world. He just said, I'm going to scatter them across the face of the earth. And so he did, right? And we speak multiple languages so that we can live separately. It's not God's intention that we unite together, right, in rebellion against him, because that is when he will have to act, right? He will have to act, and he will act, right, when he sees that the entire world, which we are doing right now, if you look around the world, the entire world is against God, including in countries like the United States that was founded on Christian principles, right? The entire globe is in rebellion against God, even when they use him. Because remember, the Jews use God a lot and they talk about, Yahweh, but they were in rebellion. So not because the US is talking about God, it means therefore that, that she is not in rebellion against God. Because the fact that she's an empire and she's imposing her will on the rest of the world means that she is rebelling against God, because it is not God's intention that any man should control the thoughts, right, and the behaviors of any other human being. It is diabolical, it is satanic, and it is contrary to the principles and to the character of the God of heaven, and you must understand that. Now, people like to think that because Europeans have really, really destroyed psychologically Black people and their identities, right? Because they have done that. And by Black here, I mean people of African descent, because we're not Black and neither are Europeans white. They are brown people, right? And they are light complected brown people. And we are of darker shades, and some of us also of lighter shades, right? So we have light brown to dark brown, to very dark brown, right? So we've got to be very, very careful of describing ourselves as Black and white. Now, with Black and this white, and remember now the whole white concept and Black concept came about in the 16th century. And this is not me talking. Lots of scholars have talked about the situation that people describe themselves by nations and cultures. The Bible separated them into different nations, right? And the Bible talks about coming back for different, people are going to be saved from different nations, kindred, and tongues and peoples, right? Not from colors, because color has nothing to do with your character or your culture, right? As I have said before, many Americans, they go to different countries and they might see, let's say you go to Argentina and you think that the population is predominantly light-skinned, right? People, um, or lighter brown complected people. Then you see a Black Argentinian or a Black Argentine, right? Then you begin to, wow, wonder, this guy might not be from Argentina. And he might be from Argentina, and he's Argentinian. But the fact of the matter is that you have been so brainwashed into believing that this person has to look a particular way. He has to have a particular color. And if he has a particular color, he might not be so much Argentinian, even though he is. And you try to rationalize because of years of brainwashing, right? And we've got to understand these things. So when you're talking about Black people, which Black people are you talking about? Who are the Black people? And do you think Black people are all the same? Do you think white Europeans are all the same? No, they are not all the same. And I say to you that even before the 16th century, they themselves, the Europeans, described themselves as the Irish race, the British race, the German race, right? The Russian race, the Italian race, because they understood that these are distinct nations and cultural, they have different cultural understandings and worldviews of the world in which they live. And that is why when you go to Western Europe, right? Now, these Western European nations, yes, they were trying to come together to reform the Roman Empire, but God had told them that it's not going to happen. And they did a lot of things, including intermarriage among them, their families, within their families, right? But God did not allow the Roman Empire to be united again, because once an empire has fallen, that empire will never rise again, because it's God who sets up, and it is he who takes down that empire. But so much about that empire. Let's talk about the fact that there is no black or white race in the Bible. What we have are descriptions of man, right? And that God created man perfect, right? He was perfect in his creation, right? Well, perfect, he was good. I shouldn't say he was perfect, because only perfect in the sense that he had perfect character, right? But when God says something is perfect, it means that it is so exalted that there's nothing more that he could have done to make that person better, right? Or more powerful, more exalted. Now, we were perfect in character, but the Bible says we were very good. He said, but Lucifer was created perfectly in terms of he was exalted. There was no other creature in the face of the universe, right, who was exalted like Lucifer. And that's why he was perfect. There was nothing that God could do in his all-powerful nature to make Lucifer more powerful. That is something hard to even conceptualize by the human brain. It is. And I'm sure by the angelic brain also, the ones who are in heaven, they probably can't even conceptualize it, right? You're talking about a being, that's Lucifer when he was created, who, when he sang, all the instruments were in his body. God designed him that way. Now, when he sang, right, the organ, or the piped instruments, all of these instruments were in his voice. And that is why he controls the entertainment industry, because there's nobody in the universe that can sing and who understands music as Lucifer does, right? And he has not lost any of his ability. And that's so when you see people in Hollywood and this great singing and stuff like that, he controls a lot of what happens there. And you're mesmerized, right? Sometimes by the singing and by the music that happens in Hollywood. So let's look at this article briefly. And I think I like it because it expresses very well. And it's coming from a Baptist website, right? Those of you who are Baptists, shout out to all the Baptists in the world. But I think this is Wachita Baptist University, right? So it's asking the question, what does the Bible say about race, right? And it opens up, let me see if I can make the font bigger so that I can read, because sometimes I can't see very well when I am reading. Now, we see here that any serious biblical study of race or ethnicity should start in Genesis 1. The Bible does not start off with the creation of a special or privileged race of people. When the first human being is created, he's simply called Adam, which is Hebrew for humankind. Adam and Eve are not Hebrews or Egyptians. They are neither white nor black nor even Semitic. And that is important for you to understand. They were just humans. Their own particular ethnicity is not even mentioned, for the Bible seems to stress that they are the mother and father of all peoples of all ethnicities. Adam and Eve are presented as non-ethnic and non-national because they represent all people of all ethnicities. So when people tend to think because the color of their skin, I hear people saying my people, right? Who are your people? Because somebody has the same color of your skin, it means that it's your people and that person shares the same values. No, it doesn't mean that, right? And you can have a dark brown complexion like I do, right? And you have a better relation with somebody who is of light complexion because guess what? You share the same values, right? The same worldviews, the same philosophies, whatever, right? But it doesn't have anything to do with the fact that because you have a similar color, it means that you are going to agree and you are going to be of one mindset, right? And behavioral nature as the person who shares a pigment, right? A skin pigment or with you, right? You have to understand that that is nonsense. And we have learned these things in schools, but we have to learn also to unlearn them. There are lots of things that we have learned in schools that we have to begin to unlearn because we have been indoctrinated. And it doesn't matter whether you've gone to white schools, as Americans like to say, or black schools. It's the same thing. When I was at Howard University, lots of talk about blackness, right? And when you look at the contradictions of some of what you hear at some of these conferences, and mind you, I participated in some of these conferences, but after a while I realized that it was a religion. Whiteness and blackness is a religion, right? So because you're exalting yourself and your supposed race, right, as the race and as a special people that, and God says in his word that he is no respecter of persons. And look at the history of the Jews and what they did. God separated them. God chose them as his people because of Abraham's faith. But during successive years, they rebelled against God. And what happened? They were enslaved. God forgave them. He took them out of Egypt and he instructed them. They became a mighty nation. And even when they became a mighty nation, they still were rebelling against God. At one point in time, they told God, I mean, they didn't tell him to his face, but that's what essentially they told Samuel, that we want a king. Not God. We don't want God as our king. God lives in heaven. We don't want him as our king. We want a man as our king. Why did they want a man as their king? Because they saw other nations around them who had monarchies in which men ruled. Even though they were so prosperous under God and their system was the best that the world could have ever found at the time, if when God was ruling them, that is, they decided that they really wanted to have a human as a king. And God told Samuel not to feel offended because they are actually speaking against him, God, not against Samuel. And God allowed them to do that, and he told them the consequences, what would have happened if they had elected a human king, and human kings they elected, and successive human kings, and they exploited them, they abused them, they oppressed them, right? And until eventually, look at what happened. They decided to kill the King of Kings, which is Christ himself, when he came to die for the human family on earth. Now, God chose them to diffuse the message to the world. So they were privileged. But with privileges, when God gives you a privilege, it comes with greater responsibilities, right? The more exalted your position, the more service you have to render, the more responsibilities you have to carry. That's why God says he didn't, Christ himself, who is God, when he came to the world, he said he came not to be served, but to render service to others. So God looks upon privileges such as chosen people to be one in which you render service and not to go around walking around that you're white or you're black and something is special about you or you're Jewish, because nothing is special about you. You are a sinner and you are dust. That is what you are. And if you understand the Bible very well, you'll understand that it requires much more service, including the washing of people's feet, right? And doing things that you would not have done normally because you think you are so exalted. right? Do you think the prime minister or the presidents of any of these countries would want to wash someone's dirty feet? I don't think they would, because they would consider that to be offensive and that it's not, something that is a part of their exalted positions. But think about the God of the universe who created the entire universe and the creatures that inhabit the universe, including this earth, that he stepped down from heaven and he came, walked among inferior men, because that's what we are. We are inferior beings, particularly after sin entered this world, right? We're inferior. And we think that we are so exalted, but we are not exalted as we think we are. And when we get sick, that's the time we know that we are not superior beings, right? Watch somebody, even the king on his throne, when he's attacked by a malignant disease, right? Even his own subjects sometimes want to run away from him or from her, right? We need to understand these things. We're not as exalted as we think we are. Some of us just go to school and we learn, 1 + 2 is equal to 2, right? And then we begin to think that we're exalted and we know things and we're even superior to God who knows everything. Can you imagine a person who knows everything, what needs to be known about chemistry, physics, astronomy, astrology, geography, mathematics, science, languages, right? Philosophy, everything, everything. Sometimes we put God in a box and we think that God is just a part of the spiritual realm. But who do you think made the physical body? It is God. So God transcends all spheres of human and any creature's existence, right? So he's God, so this understanding of, oh, it's religion, and religion is something that only deals with the spiritual nature. No, no, no. God is interested in our physical, in our economic, in our social, in just every sphere of our existence. It's time for us to understand that and not to just limit religion to spiritual understanding. And that is why when God was king and the leader of Israel, their health never failed them. Their physical constitution was strong because God told them what to eat and what not to eat, because he made the human body and he knows what is nutritious and what is not nutritious for the human constitution, right? So God is the God of science. God is the God of sociology. God is the God of mathematics. God is the God of physics because he created all of these things and he gave us to study, and that as we study, we would understand the creator more than if we had not studied it. Why do you think the angels in heaven understand him? Because they have studied his creative genius and his creative works. Now, in Genesis 1, verse 26, God says, let us make man, Adam, in our own image according to our likeness. And that is in Genesis 1, verse 27. Describes his creative action. So God created man, Adam, in his own image. He created him in the image of God. He created them, male and female. And notice that he's saying them, two distinct people, right? But they are man, which is the fact that women came from man. The image of God relates to one or more of the following: the mental and spiritual faculties that people share with God. Number two, the appointment of humankind as God's representatives on earth. And three, the capacity to relate to God. Yet what is clear is what is being created in the image of God is a spectacular blessing. It is what distinguishes people from animals. Likewise, whether or not the image of God in people was marred or blurred in the fall of Genesis 3, it is clear that at the very least, people still carry some aspect of the image of God. And this gives humankind a very special status in the creation. Furthermore, as mentioned above, Adam and Eve are ethnically generic, right? Very important to understand, representing all ethnicities. Thus, the Bible is very clear in declaring from the beginning that all people of all races and ethnicities carry the image of God. There is no black or white, as you have been told. Remember, I told you also that the elites, particularly in the 16th century, as the transatlantic slave trade, started to be developed, right? That they wanted us to be divided, right? Because what if you had the mulattoes combining with what they call the black people in the on the slave plantations? Well, what's going to happen? Then you're going to have a united effort against the Europeans, their slave masters, right? So they had to develop the Willie Lynch syndrome, right, in which they would divide the populations of these colonies, right? And so that we would not launch the people then, or foreparents, right, or ancestors rather, what am I saying, would not be able to launch some rebellion against these white or so-called over slave masters. Now, the reality, or this reality, provides a strong starting point for our discussion of what the Bible says about race. Indeed, John Scott declares both the dignity and the equality of human beings are traced in Scripture to our creation. To presuppose that one's own race or ethnicity is superior to someone else's is a denial of the fact that all people are created in the image of God. When I look at people around the world, that's what I see. I see the image of God. Sometimes, of course, it's not reflected because some of them are really evil. But when you look at the superficial level, the fact that we have two hands, right, 10 fingers, two eyes, a head, and all of the things that human beings have, that is who we are, right? We are created in the image of God. Now, many of us do not reflect his character, right? We reflect the character of the devil because when sin entered the world, we had now two conflicting forces, right? Striving for the mastery. And you decide what power you want to rule your lives. And some of us, unfortunately, have chosen to unite with the power of the devil, while some have decided to unite their power or their character with that of their maker, which is God. Now, the book of Proverbs presents several practical implications from this connection between God and the people he created. For example, Proverbs 14, verse 31 states, "The one who oppresses the poor insults their maker." And Proverbs 17 says, echoes this teaching, "The one who mocks the poor insults his maker," right? So God is the God of all creation, right? Now, let's look at the so-called curse of Ham, because some people say that, wow, Black people who are Hamitic people, who are descendants of Ham, and Ham was one of Noah's sons. Now, in Genesis 9, we heard an account, because after the flood, the earth had been turned upside down, right? God broke up the surface of the earth, and it was not the same earth that Noah and his family were accustomed to after the flood. The earth was not as beautiful. It remains beautiful, but it lost a lot of its beauty when after the flood. Can you imagine what paradise was before the flood? It must have been gloriously a beautiful place to have lived. Now remember that it had never rained, but now it rained, and we thought the Bible said, according to the Bible, that the surface of the deep was opened up. God really opened up everything, and rocks came out of the surface of the deep. And we see the mountains and other. So the earth is not as beautiful and perfect in the way in which it was made when God created Adam and Eve to occupy this world. In regard to the history of racial prejudice in America, no other passage in scripture has been as abused, distorted, and twisted as has Genesis 9, verse 18 to 27. Thus, it is important that we clarify what this passage actually says and doesn't say. So we have in Genesis 9, verse 20 to 21, after the flood is over and his family has settled down, Noah gets drunk and passes out lying naked in his tent. His son Ham, which I am saying now is the father of the Black people, or people who live in Africa and thereabout, specifically identified as the father of Canaan, right, sees him and tells his two brothers, Shem and Japheth. Now, Shem, as we say, is the descendant of all Semites. That's why we call it, hence the word Semite. When we talk about anti-Semite or Semite, right, comes from Shem. And Japheth, the father of the European people or peoples, who then carefully cover up their father. When Noah wakes up and finds out what happened, he pronounces a curse on Canaan, not on Ham, the son of Ham, stating, "Cursed be Canaan, the lowest of slaves will be to his brothers." Noah then blesses Shem and Japheth, declaring, "Blessed be the Lord of Shem, may Canaan be the slave of Shem. May God extend the territory of Japheth, and may Canaan be his slave." Now, notice here that God is pronouncing a curse on Canaan, and that is one of Ham's son, not on all children of Ham or Ham himself, right? And we've got to understand that. But people have distorted this biblical account, this biblical narrative, by suggesting that God placed a curse on all Black people and that we were supposed to have been subservient to the children and to the descendants of Ham and of Shem. But that is not true. And that is why we've got to read our Bibles for ourselves, and we've got to read the entire Bible and to compare scriptures with scriptures so we can get a full understanding of the context in which God speaks, right? Because some of us speak with a lot of ignorance, even those who should have more sense and who should have more education, but we tend not to want to delve deeper into biblical matters, religious matters. We just think that we should go and study some things that men have said, and then we, um, think that these are definitive conclusions, right? And there's nothing else to study. Now, in the 19th century, before and after the Civil War, this text was frequently called by whites to argue that the slavery or subjugation of the Black race was, in fact, a fulfillment of the prophecy in this text. These pastors and writers argued that, one, the word Ham really means black or burnt, and thus refers to the Black race, and second, that God commanded that the descendants of Ham, Black people, become slaves to Japheth, who they argued represents the white race, right? Now, that is a distortion of what the Bible teaches, and that's what we need to understand. And some of us don't want to understand it because we love to say that I am the superior one. So Blacks say that I'm the superior one, I'm God's, I'm the Jew, right? And why do you want to be a Jew? I ask all Black people, why do you want to be a Jew when a Jew had so many responsibilities, right? And God had, they rebelled against God. They don't have a favorable history in the Bible. When you read the history in the Bible of the Jews, it is a history primarily of rebellion. Yes, he chose them, and we have his faithful patriarchs like Abraham and Jacob and Isaac. But yeah, these men, of course, they were not perfect, but when they sinned and God pointed out their sins to them, they repented, right? But what we have in the Bible, for the most part, of course, you had faithful Israelites and Jews, but for the most part, they were a rebellious, as the Bible says, and stiff-necked people. Nothing particularly great that we think that they were so great that we want to have that sort of identity, right? And the history of the human race in general, be they African or Europeans or Asians, right, is a rebellious one, right? As the Bible says, that no one is perfect. No, not one, right? No, not one. We have all human beings have a history because when sin entered the world through Adam, right, rebellion came into our hearts. And that's why we need Christ to extract that rebellion, right? And that wickedness from our hearts. Because as Jeremiah 17, verse 9 says, that the human heart is wicked above all things, right? It is a wicked heart that we have. And we want to exalt ourselves above our fellow brethren. That is our quest. And that is why we see the United States in its quest as an empire. And all empires have done that to ensure and to inflict serious harms upon people. Because if they don't accept that they are superior, then I have to kill them or inflict serious harms upon them. Right? And that is what white people, so-called white people, did. Europeans did to people of African descent. Because they had gotten some power, they decided that they would exploit their brothers and sisters in Africa, right? Now, the fact of the matter here, and we've got to understand this, is that the more civilized, so-called civilized or wealth or power that we get, the more we acquire in knowledge, it's the more barbaric we become. And look at the United States and how rapidly after its independence it came up on the scenes. Now, when it was practicing slavery during the 16th and 17th, let us say that, up to 1820, the United States was not as wealthy as it had become after, say, 1820, when it really upgraded its system of slavery, right? And it rose rapidly. And the more they built universities, particularly in the North, and the more industries that were instituted and came into being, right? We found that it's the more that human hearts became very hardened, right? Yes. So when we think that we are at the height of civilization, now we have lots of technologies and we think we're great. That is why we're seeing the wealth being concentrated into the hands of the few. It happened after the Civil War in the United States, right? That having had the Civil War and the military occupation of the South, that eventually, after the war, these capitalists in the North and the South, right, united their efforts in concentrating the wealth into the hands of the few. And we had these robber barons, right, that we had in developing in the 1880s and the 1890s, right, where the wealth was concentrated into the hands of the very few. And there was gross inequality in the United States of America, right? And the presidents like to say these are not our values, as if the United States was some country of, you know, exemplary country, I should say, the country in which people were always equal. It has never been a country in which people have always been equal. It's a fight. It's a war. And we've got to understand that. And the fact of the matter is that, as I've said, that these elites are not concerned about the color of your skin, right? They only make a big deal out of it because it is their purpose to deceive us and also to divide us, that we will not be of any challenge to their wealth and the status quo that they have created. We've got to understand that. But it's not that the United States and the elites deem the people who share similar skin pigment with them to be on their equal um, level. They don't. They don't regard these people as being their equals. And you need to understand that. So we just like to talk about simple things, oh, the whites versus the blacks, which doesn't make any sense, right? If we understand the history very well. Now, so we've got to understand, and we can go deep into different things about, let's look at the ethnic composition of biblical Israel. Using cultural and geographical boundary markers such as language, territory, religion, dress, parents, and ancestor origins, the ancient peoples in the regions in and around ancient Israel can be split up into four major ethnic groups. The Asiatics or Semites, including the Israelites, Canaanites, the Amorites, and the Arameans. The Cushites, number two, Black Africans living along the Nile River south of Egypt, also referred to as the Nubians or Ethiopians, although they are not connected to modern Ethiopia. Third, the Egyptians, a mix of Asiatic or Asiatic, North African, and African elements. And fourth, Indo-Europeans, Hittites, and the Philistines. Right? So we see here that they are a mixture of all of these people, or peoples, if you will. Right? So we tend to just look upon this, and this is a color, and look at, for example, the Jews. The Jews are all over. You have Black Jews, you have Jews who live in Africa, because they're all over the world. You have the white Jews, German Jews, British Jews, American Jews, right? Jamaican Jews, Trinidadian Jews. They're all over the face of the world, and they have distinct features, even though they are ethnically Jews, whether they're Black or what you call white, or Asian, if you will. So we tend to think in this reductionist, we have this reductionist understanding of the word, the simplistic concept of what a Semite is or is not, because our school systems have really indoctrinated us and have really given us a narrow understanding of the world in which we live. And that is why we're having so many wars, because the elites have brainwashed us. And we do not want to unlearn a lot of the things that we think we know. Now, ancient Israel develops from within the Asiatic Semitic group of peoples, although several of the other groups have significant input. Note that Israel is not mentioned in Genesis 10 as one of the ancient peoples. When God first calls Abraham, he is living in Ur of the Chaldees, an Amorite region of Mesopotamia. Yet later in the Bible, Abraham is most closely associated with the Arameans, right? That is Genesis 24, verse 4. And we also have Genesis 28, verse 5, Deuteronomy 26, verse 5. While both Abraham's son Isaac and grandson Jacob, many Aramean women, the next generation also marries Canaanites, right? So we have, and Egyptians. So, so you see this intermingling, right? There has always been this intermingling of the human family, because we're humans. Now, what God was against was not the color of their skins. He was against the fact that some of these nations were idolatrous nations. And he did not want the intermingling of his people with other nations. It has nothing to do with the color of your skin, but with what's your name, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. deems to be the content of one's character, the values that one shares. And that's why it's very, very interesting to see in America Americans behaving childishly even now, thinking that there is a distinct behavioral norms from of the what you call white Americans to black Americans. You know, I had a white American who told me and who seemed to have this philosophy that the problems that afflict African Americans in the United States is because it's due to their African heritage. That's just nonsense. That is utter nonsense. The problems that afflict Black Americans are American grown. They are American grown. That is the essence of the problem. Because when we think about the problems, for example, in education, in some cases that afflict African Americans, and the fact that some of them don't even consider education to be important to them because they feel so alienated from society. It's an American cultural norm because they're the ones who created that. They're the ones who have allowed African Americans to think that they are inferior to these so-called white people. I dare any man to think that he's superior, or woman to think that he's superior to me. I dare anybody to think so, because you're not. And I don't behave that way. If you have an understanding of the Bible, you know that no man, regardless of his economic condition or whatever color skin he might have, is not superior to you, right? Because we are dust. And every time you go to a funeral, that should be understood, that we are not here forever. And even if you're very wealthy, you are going under the soil. Right? We've got to understand that. And even empires, if the United States were to understand that now, that it's going to eventually, that empire is going to eventually be crumbled by God. God is going to destroy the American empire. He destroyed the Jews when they behaved badly. Their temple was destroyed in AD 70 because they just would not listen to God. They wouldn't obey him. So he destroyed them and their temple. And they worshipped their temple. In fact, their temple, the Jewish temple, you know, in their eyes, was even superior to Christ himself. Right? We've got to take stock. And now we're worshiping at the altar of technology and science. Right? Now, what's going to happen to us when God destroys these tools that he has given to us? But we have abused. Right? What's going to happen to us? Some of us, we can't even live a day, and I'm guilty of that too. We can't even live a day without our phones, right? We can live without our Bibles, but we can't live without our phones because we have to be connected and we have to speak to people, right? And may God help us, because some of the people with whom we're speaking, you know, have nothing to say to us, nothing of consequence, right? Now, it is during the 400 plus year sojourn in Egypt that the family of Abraham develops linguistically and culturally into an identifiable Israelite people. Yet even then, in terms of ethnicity, they are hardly monolithic. And I like this word. We tend to view people monolithically. We think that, oh, Jamaicans behave this way, or Trinidadians behave this way, or Nigerians behave this way, and we're all guilty of that, or all Haitians behave this way. But we are not monolithic, particularly because we have been having a history of constant migration and emigration and the intermixing of people, because that's who we are. We are people. We are human beings, not races. Yes, we have different ethnicities and we have different nationalities and we have different linguistic and cultural groups. but we are not of different races. We are essentially humans. And if that is something that you are going to gain from this video, please understand that. And because you're human, you are capable of anything under God, that God, whatever assignment that God renders you to do it with all your might. Because nobody but God is greater than you or is superior to you. And I want to say that to all African Americans and to all people who think that they're Black around the world, in the diaspora as well as on the continent, right? That the Bible enjoins upon you, right, to be faithful to Him and to live your fullest potential and human capacity. And don't think about what another man says to you, because it's of no significance. Follow what God says, because that is going to be consequential, not what a man of an inferior intellect tells you to do or not to do, as a matter of fact. In addition to the various ethnic streams that influenced the formation of the Israelite nation during the patriarchal period, numerous other ethnic influences continued to shape the formation of Israel. For example, when God delivers Israel from Egypt, the Bible mentions that an ethnically diverse crowd went up with them. And that is true. That is the truth of the matter. That is the crux of the matter. It was a mixed nation that went up from Egypt, the same way in which the American population is mixed. Right? They have been having these groups of people living with them. And let me just share this video with you a little, right? Of it. Maybe I can't show everything, but it says, we are all Black. Let me share my screen, because it's important that we understand the essence of, oh, I have it here. I have it here already. So I'm actually sharing my screen. I thought I wasn't, but I am actually sharing my screen. So we are all Black. Geneticist Brian Sykes, and he is British. And this is this guy I referenced yesterday in my video by saying that we really are not Black or white, right? Essentially, we're all Blacks, if that is what it is, because we all came from Africa, right? That's where civilization started, somewhere in the Middle East, right? Middle East, Africa. The world has been so, every time you have an empire, they divide or they change the cartography, they change the world map, right? And because they conquer different regions and areas, right? And as a result of that, what might have been considered to be an African country might now be a Middle Eastern country. You know, look at what happened when the United States conquered the world, right? So Hawaii now is a part of the United States, you know, and we have countries like, Puerto Rico, which was, a bona fide Caribbean country. It is in the Caribbean region, but it's not a U.S. state, but it's, Commonwealth of the United States, among others like the Guam and, you know, so we see where when countries become, an empire, that they can alter the map, right? The world map, and how we understand the geography of countries, right? So we have to, and it's a very, very complicated system. So we don't want to get into that. What we do understand is that we are essentially human beings, right? And not to be categorized in different racial hierarchical structures. Got to understand that. I'm thankful to God that the Bible is the book of all books that teaches that particular concept. Now, let me have you listen to this.
You find answers to life's most existential questions, especially cable news questions like who are we? Where do we come from? How are we all connected? But our specialist today is a geneticist whose groundbreaking DNA research provides some new clues into some of those very quandaries, at least when it comes to our physical constitution. It paints a picture of a deep and interwoven American ancestry in the process. And joining us now is Professor Brian Sykes, human genetics professor at Oxford University and author of DNA USA, a genetic biography of America. What don't we know that you do know about our genetic history that is most startling, you think?
I think I know everything about your genetics.
So when you look at it, what's
Not yours personally, Dylan.
No, well, not yet.
That can be done with relative ease.
I'll give you a cheek swab.
I won't leave without one.
But when you look at the analysis, what bore itself out?
Well, fundamentally, what I was interested in looking at America is here you have a fantastic convergence of three continents from a genetic point of view. I just wanted to see how they mixed up, what it showed about individual origins, even within people, how different parts of their genes had come from different places and what they thought about it.
What'd you find?
There's a lot of mixing, as you would have guessed, but it's not just that you have African Americans and Native Americans, American and European Americans within their DNA. You can see traces of almost all of those in almost everybody. I, for example, discovered that I have a piece of African DNA. I've got an African ancestor somewhere or other. It helps run my pancreas. So
in a nutshell, we are all everybody.
Yeah, we're all everybody. So it's not just the individuals are mixed up in America, but you've got that mixture within yourself, and your genes are cooperating with each other. Because if they didn't, you'd be dead.
I think I understand from your research that you think that America may have had some European visitors sort of before 1492. It sort of dates back earlier than that. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, this is work that uses a very, very good indicator of ancestry, which is a piece of DNA inherited down the maternal line. Now, when Native American ancestry was worked on, I have to say, usually without permission from the people involved, which was scandalous. But when that was looked at, there were four groups of people four groups of ancestors that made up the majority of Native Americans. However, in recent years, a fifth group has been identified, particularly in tribes that live close to the Great Lakes, the Ojibwe tribe in particular. And the matches with the four main groups of Native Americans are from Siberia and Eastern Asia. But in the Great Lakes, this particular cluster of DNA comes not from Asia. There's no trace of it there. That's from Europe. So I think around about the same time, something about 10,000 years ago, there was a small group of people that came from Europe directly over the Atlantic, which was partly frozen then, so it could have got round at the edge of the ice. And I think that's the most likely explanation for what we see in a small proportion of Native Americans.
Okay. Well, in American society today, we definitely see there is significant racial sort of grouping off. There's intermarriage between blacks and whites and Asians and whites, but that's the exception in my observation. So I guess how much does it matter how much a country like ours sort of intermixes racially? Does it make a big difference? Or would we be more the same if there's more Asian and European and African intermarriage? Or does that not make a difference very much physically and physiologically?
Well, you're sort of asking the question if it was totally mixed up, whether all Americans look identical, they wouldn't. But there's an enormous amount of mixing has already taken place, whether or not it's acknowledged. For example, amongst African Americans, I don't think there are any African Americans that don't have some European ancestry. And talking to my volunteers, I went around the country getting samples from African Americans, European Americans. Some of them were surprised and thought they didn't have any European ancestors, but they certainly all do. I mean, I'd be most surprised if I found one that did. Amongst European Americans, particularly in the south. I didn't find any that didn't have some African ancestors as well.
So you mean Spain, Italy?
No, I mean
No, southern US.
US,
Okay.
the southern US. That's yeah. And so all of the, I didn't ask for DNA from hundreds or thousands of people, but all the ones I did test, all the volunteers from the south, the European Americans, had quite substantial sometimes elements of African DNA. So they had African ancestors. So it's a bit ironic because the one drop rule, which you probably know about, would have classified them all as slaves.
That's sort of
Everybody in the South would be a slave by the one drop rule.
But one thing I regret I never did manage to find was an extreme white supremacist or a member of the Ku Klux Klan. Because had I tested them, and if they were from the South, I'm pretty sure they would have had some African DNA. My next question would have been, because one of the great things about this particular test is you can identify which genes you've got from where. So let's say a member of the Ku Klux Klan had a gene which was controlling his kidneys, for example, from an African ancestor. Would he rather do without his kidney? I think not, but I would love to have asked the question.
How many people did you sample? I mean, in some ways, it's almost curious to me that we don't see even more of this. I know we approach it from the idea of expecting that everyone is sort of genetically somewhat homogeneous, but I would imagine there's a lot of this.
Oh, yes, yeah, there is. I mean, it's probably least noticeable amongst the which again surprised me, amongst the descendants of early New England settlers. I asked for volunteers amongst people whose ancestors arrived before 1650, and I thought, well, I'm hardly going to get any, but I had hundreds and hundreds of volunteers. And I was expecting, as a geneticist who tend to have rather jaundiced view about mating practices, I was expecting to find a lot of Native American ancestry there amongst the descendants of the early settlers, but I didn't. I only found that in one instance, a man who knew he had a Mohawk ancestor, I was able to show that that Mohawk ancestor had given him some DNA that was actually controlling his blood group.
Very quickly, this is a big question for a short period of time, but if in fact most human beings carry the genes for pretty much every race to some degree or another, which is what you're asserting, that a lot of us carry a wide mixture of a wide variety of racial history, such that genetically we are effectively everybody, even though I look like a certain, we all have an outward appearance. What are the implications for racism if we're all carrying the same gene pool?
Well, this would take hours to define what racism meant, but it demonstrates once again that there's no one-to-one biological equivalence between race and biology.
The other long conversation we can have now as a geneticist is your jaundiced view of male-female relations. You're a man who knows too much for about too many people. Professor, a pleasure. Congratulations on the book.
Right. So that is a very important research that has been done. And you have seen it by this professor, right? And you can get his book. It was on the screen. And he spoke about the fact that we are definitely all related, right, as human beings. So science is concurring with the biblical account that it is from one man, not from one nation. I always say one nation, but it is from one man that God made all nations to dwell on the face of the earth, right? That's what God did. Now, because God is so powerful, he's all powerful, all power is given unto him, right? Then he's able to superficially paint our bodies in different skin tones, all right, or pigmentation. And we look at these tones of, of skin, the skin pigment, the pigmentation, and we begin to think that that is what defines that human being, right? And you must give credit to the slave masters, the European slave masters, who thought that looking at skin color and using it as a weapon, weaponizing it against the populations of these colonies was a great propaganda. And it is sad, though, that the United States citizens who I consider to be the most propagandized population in the world, because they, of course, are a part of an empire that is the greatest, right? If not one of the greatest empires the world has ever seen. They still embrace the concept of color and colorism and racism as something that defines them. Because as I've said before, the United States citizens cannot view you outside of your skin color. The first thing that they look at is whether you are Black or white or Hispanic or Asian. And with that comes all manner of what is in their narrow minds about how these people should behave or ways in which they should not behave, right? And when it conflicts with their narrow understanding, right, of how these people should behave or not behave, then, they, they just sometimes, don't know how to respond. You look at their faces. Look at the faces of the journalists when the guy was speaking, the British guy was speaking. They were clueless, right? They were clueless because they can't understand. And, the question was asked, what's the purpose of racism then if we're all the same people? And what I would have said if I were the geneticist and they wouldn't have liked it, I would have told them that that is pure ignorance and that you need to educate yourself and, understand that we're all the same. And, the whole concept of your thinking that, oh, he's white and he's Black. And this is not only for the so-called white race. This also is directed toward people of African descent, Black Americans, Black whomever you are, that you are not superior to the white man, the so-called white man, or to the European. And Europeans are not superior to any Black man, right? Because we're coming from one man, from one human family, despite the diversity in our phenotypical appearance, right? And we need to thank God for that diversity, right? Because in diversity, that's the beauty of the human family. Is it nice that, white, so-called white people find darker, some, not all, find some darker skinned people or darker skinned tone people to be attractive, and they like to join with each other because human beings like diversity, right? And God gave us diversity in everything, the flowers and the plants, right? Or the trees, just about everything that we have on earth. God has endowed his creation with diversity. So in this Black History Month, right, I'd like to suggest, and I said yesterday too, that we need to humanize it, right, and not put it on a pedestal like, Black people are gods, because we're not gods, right? And this thinking that all of us came from kings and queens in Africa is also nonsense, right? That is not true. In the same way that all peoples of Europe or Asia did not emanate from kings and queens. And I don't like when Black people say that, because we know that is not true. We understand that just like in any other empires and civilization, we've had a lot of inequities in society, right? And to be fair to Europeans, particularly those nations of the Protestant churches, that, ascribed to the Protestant faith of the Bible, right? The biblical understanding, the biblical worldview of the world, right? Those who align themselves with the biblical worldview. Let me just say that. They tended to order their society, after some amount of equality, right? Because only under the Bible, under God, we are all equal, right? And the Jews didn't want to understand that. When Christ came to the earth, they thought that they should be the exalted one because they were considered to be God's chosen people. And because they were considered to be called God's chosen people, they thought that they should have been exalted by Christ. And Christ told them, no, I came not here to serve or to be served, but to serve. right? That's what Christ came to do, right? To render his life, right? Greater love hath no man than this, that a man should lay down his life for his friends, right? So for this Black History Month, let's consider that no man is an island. No man stands alone. Each man is dear to me. Each man is my friend. He's my brother. Please, let's stop dividing the human family. Don't allow the elites of this world who have merged themselves together, be they African, Asian, or Europeans, they are in league with each other against us, right? And we ought not to allow ourselves to be divided by their erroneous and spurious philosophies and teachings, right? Let's unite and let's fight against all social, religious, economic injustices as we possibly can. Thank you so much for joining. I look forward to seeing you in another chat. Okay, so have a fantastic day. Until next time, adios. Bye.